Hello, in this video, I want to talk a little bit more about what racial capitalism would look like as an affirmative strategy on the upcoming worker strike resolution. I think that there are a lot of really interesting and complex ways to talk about the place that racial capitalism fits in, and I feel like if you're a team that's already kind of like hip to the cap literature base, or you're a team that's really trying to figure out what the cap literature base would really look like on a topic that's really strongly about capitalism, this is definitely a good reference point for you to find, and I would definitely watch the video that I did right before this, kind of like talking about what I think are some of the priorities for like making this type of affirmative really strong. And now in this video, I kind of want to develop what that kind of looks like in the context of criticisms, counterplans, and disads. I think that it's really important here where we kind of start diving into like a more like method-based explanation of like what these types of affirmatives can really look like, and hopefully putting together a more concrete picture of how you can then weigh this against some of the criticisms that I think will be popular in the resolution. And I definitely think it's a place where I can kind of hopefully round out some of the stuff that we've been talking about in the other videos. So make sure if you haven't checked them out that you look at the intro to racial capitalism and worker strike, and you also look at the first couple of videos that I did talking about as a negative strategy, because I think those kind of lay out some of the bare backbones, like core arguments for like what is really important structurally to have and be thinking about historically for these arguments to make sense. And I kind of just want to continue that pacing and idea now as we kind of move in and talk a little bit more about what this looks like as an affirmative strategy and how you can really address these like different types of arguments. So first, let's kind of talk a little bit about what this kind of looks like versus criticisms. First of all, I think when you're thinking about racial capitalism and its relationship to the resolution, I think a great place to kind of start a lot of your like method conversation would be around ideas like destituent power, would be around arguments around negativity, arguments that are about focusing on the lumpen proletariat and like the general strike and what that looks like as something that is just explicit refusal of the state, and looking into like what examples that you can kind of pull in order to kind of like make a specific method that is geared around and answering the kind of core crux criticism that we kind of like made of the resolution in that first set of arguments in the last video, where we kind of talked about like what the ideal version of this affirmative looks like. I think that being able to really answer and have a method that really like harnesses its like methodological explanation out of the kind of like devaluing of the state as a locus for strategy is like incredibly important for how you're able to make a really good strategy and like one that's really coherent and follows through. The reason why I think this is good against criticisms, even though obviously like a lot of criticisms are going to be anti-state, is that I think when you're making arguments about why like political energy becomes generated off of our like mutual responsibility and refusing the state, you have a lot of good arguments about like why the kind of way that you're framing your relationship to like capitalism as a whole is not necessitated as one that's like a universal logic, but one that is about like mutual commitment to revolutionary action, which I think is a much easier organizing principle to defend against a lot of criticisms. I feel like most criticisms are really like basically reaching at, when they're trying to debate against the Cap K, the ability to essentialize struggle through via the concept and identity of the worker. But I feel like if you have that kind of explicit critique that we were talking about in the 1AC about why the worker is kind of an incomplete starting point for how we think about like the accumulation of violence, then you have a really good argument to weigh against criticisms about why the 1AC is contextual to the various ways in which racial dispossession kind of creates the proxy for how we're able to think about the evolution of capitalism domestically in America, and like why it's such like a force for the kickstart of industrialization. And through that, you're able to kind of win that this kind of like universalizing claim that they're making about the affirmative kind of goes out the window. And that already kind of like broad sweeps a lot of the link arguments that I feel like most critical teams are really prepared to make uncomfortable making on this resolution. I then think that it's really important for you to basically make a bunch of arguments about like why the kind of framing of the debate through the question of how we're able to choose tactics in the face of the refusal of the state is really important. I feel like there's a really good acknowledgement to make about the resolution that pretty much every critical AF and every critical argument is starting from the same locus point of refusing the state because of how important like state recognition as an idea is to the core of the resolution, that it's important for everyone as at an advocacy and method level to kind of like take the second step into being able to think about like method explanation beyond simple refusal of the things that and the tools that we know we don't have proper access to now, and thinking about ways of being able to create new forms of resistance in the face of that. And I think there's when you're able to get like a really strong method v method debate that allows you to pull out some of your more like best link turn arguments and permutation arguments. And if you're winning that framing argument, you're kind of able to use the educational benefits of those framing arguments as additional net benefits to the permutation, which I think will make the execution of that strategy feel a lot better when it's paired with kind of the offense that we were talking about before, in terms of like their ability to think about like the universalization of Marx and like your ability to kind of avoid that. And then I think to kind of like round that out out with a little bit more offense. A lot of the stuff that I think I would really try to push on this flow is just being able to kind of like win that basically that if you're able to have like a question of a competing thesis that is really able to like question like the core consensus of like the negatives prioritization or deprioritization of capitalism and of material violence, then you have a lot of places to take that framing and not just use it as a permutation argument, but to jettison the permutation argument and fully weigh it as a reason why the outweighs and turns a lot of the questions on the criticism, and why it kind of does get to that immediacy question that the affirmative is able to resolve better if they kind of refuse to have the debate about the historical terms that you really want to speak on. I then think that when you kind of transition some of this advice into like what that looks like on counterplan and dissat debate, I definitely feel like a lot of the arguments that like I would make if I were reading counterplan dissat would definitely be down the route of making arguments about why, you know, recognizing workers' right to strike is kind of key to democracy and like global spillover, and why the kind of idea that you can kind of like risk it all and the global spillover that could be like created by the like states' recognition of workers' strike visa your like explicit refusal of the state because of past violence basically triggers kind of like this like downside of democracy and like war and all these other things. And I think that the best way for you to kind of like answer an argument that goes down that line is to make arguments about how there's a different way for people to create global coalitions without the use of the state. This is, I think, where you get into a lot of like really complicated but interesting history about like how people internationally have kind of like shown solidarity for various types of anti-capitalist, like racial violence movements that have like really been critical to the development of resistance tactics. Even when you think about, for instance, the relationship that like BLM members have had to like members of Palestine, etc. There's just such a long lineage of like the ways in which, for instance, the Black Panther Party and Mao, or the Black Panther Party, or W.E.B. Du Bois and his relationship to Pan-Africa and their relationship to China, etc., and arguments about third world, all kind of show the possibility, third worldism, also all kind of show the possibility of like what a different type of international collective should look like. And I think being able to bring those to the forefront of how you're framing like a differential way to resolve the kind of like impacts that kind of plan to said, with a critique about why the promotion of American democracy kind of conceals and creates its own form of like terror and violence and genocide domestically, then you have a lot of like good offense and defense to play off of to develop a strong strategy against counterplans and dissets that really indict the central crux of why their understanding of our relationship to the state is violent. And hopefully that kind of like gives you a good idea of like some of the stuff that you could be saying as you go forward into the resolution. And so, as always, thank you for watching.